In 2013, federal agents were closing in on the biggest online drug marketplace the internet had ever seen, a hidden site called Silk Road, run by a mysterious figure known only as Dread Pirate Roberts. Behind the scenes, a task force of DEA and Secret Service agents worked for months undercover, gaining the trust of the site's operator, building the case that would eventually put him away for life. What nobody outside that task force knew was that two of its own agents were quietly running a much smaller, much greedier operation of their own, stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars in Bitcoin from the very investigation they were supposed to be building. This is the story of Carl Force and Sean Bridges, the two federal agents who tried to rob Silk Road while pretending to shut it down. Carl Force was a 15-year veteran of the DEA, assigned to the Baltimore Silk Road Task Force. His job was to go undercover inside the marketplace itself, posing as a corrupt official willing to sell Ulbricht inside information for a price. He built an undercover persona named Knob, supposedly a drug trafficker with connections deep inside law enforcement, and used it to earn Ulbricht's trust over months of private conversations. On paper, Knob was a sanctioned undercover identity, approved and monitored by the DEA. In practice, Force started running the character far outside the lines of any approved operation, extracting real payments from Ulbricht under the table and pocketing them for himself. By the time the Baltimore Task Force was assembled, Silk Road had grown into something unprecedented, a hidden marketplace reachable only through anonymizing software, where buyers and sellers used Bitcoin to trade drugs, forged documents, and worse, all while believing the entire system was untraceable. At its peak, the site processed well over $1 billion in transactions. Taking it down required agents willing to spend months building fake identities, earning trust inside forums and encrypted chats, and slowly working their way close enough to the site's operator to identify him. It was slow, invisible work, the kind that gives an undercover agent enormous access and almost no oversight, which is exactly the environment Carl Force found himself in. Force didn't stop at one persona. He quietly created a second undercover identity, called French Maid, who claimed to have inside knowledge of the ongoing federal investigation into Silk Road. Through this fake identity, Force sold Ulbricht supposed insider tips about the very case Force himself was working, essentially getting paid twice, once by the government to investigate Ulbricht, and once by Ulbricht to warn him about the investigation. Then things escalated into something far darker. Ulbricht had grown suspicious that one of his own employees, a customer support representative named Curtis Green, was stealing from Silk Road. Believing Green needed to be eliminated, Ulbricht contacted Knob, the corrupt official persona, and asked him to arrange Green's murder. Rather than shutting the request down, Force and other agents staged the killing. They faked a violent death by waterboarding, photographed the scene to look convincingly real, and sent the images to Ulbricht as proof the job had been done. Ulbricht paid for a murder that never happened, believing for months that he was responsible for the death of someone who was, in fact, very much alive and now cooperating with the same investigators Force was supposedly protecting. Force's greed didn't stop there either. In one especially brazen move, he learned that a different target of a separate investigation, referred to in court documents only by initials, held a balance of digital currency with an exchange called CoinMKT. Using his authority as a federal agent, Force directed the exchange to seize that person's funds, despite having no legitimate legal basis to do so. He then quietly transferred the seized money into his own personal accounts and cashed it out. All told, prosecutors would later determine that Force had diverted more than $700,000 in digital currency into his own pocket over the course of the investigation, using his badge as leverage every step of the way. While Force was running his elaborate web of fake personas, a second agent inside the same task force was working an entirely separate scheme. Sean Bridges, a Secret Service special agent also assigned to the Baltimore group, had access to the digital evidence seized during the January 2013 arrest of Curtis Green, the Silk Road employee Ulbricht had believed was murdered. Using Green's administrator credentials on the Silk Road website, Bridges quietly reset the passwords and PINs on a number of accounts and redirected roughly 20,000 Bitcoin, worth about $350,000 at the time, into a digital wallet he personally controlled. The fallout from Bridges' theft was almost darkly comic, given what was happening elsewhere in the investigation. When Ulbricht noticed that Bitcoin had been drained from accounts tied to Green's administrator access, he assumed Green himself was behind it, and, still under the impression Green had already been killed once, ordered a second hit on him in retaliation, again communicating through the same corrupted undercover channel Force was running. Two federal agents were now tangled in a scheme where a real target believed he had already paid to have a man murdered, was ordering a second murder over a theft committed not by that man, but by one of the agents investigating him. Bridges moved quickly to cash out. He funneled the stolen Bitcoin into an account at Mt. Gox, at the time one of the world's largest cryptocurrency exchanges, and liquidated it into roughly $820,000 in U.S. currency between March and May of 2013. From there, the money moved into personal investment accounts, and eventually into a shared bank account with another individual. He also used his position to limit Curtis Green's continued access to Silk Road, which conveniently hampered the very grand jury investigation he was supposed to be supporting, since Green's cooperation and access were central to building the case against Ulbricht. There's a particularly grim irony buried in this timeline. Curtis Green had already lived through one staged execution, orchestrated by the very government that was supposedly protecting him, purely to satisfy a drug lord's paranoia. Now, because of an entirely different agent's theft, he was the target of a second contract killing he had no idea was being arranged, over a crime he hadn't committed. Green never learned any of this was happening in real time. He was, by all accounts, simply trying to survive an arrest that had upended his life, unaware that two separate federal agents were using his identity, his access, and his reputation as cover for their own crimes. For nearly 2 years, both schemes ran in parallel, hidden inside an investigation that was, on the surface, one of the most successful cybercrime operations in DEA and Secret Service history. Ulbricht was eventually arrested in October 2013 in a public library in San Francisco, and Silk Road was shut down. But the digital trail both agents left behind hadn't disappeared. It was sitting on the blockchain the entire time, a permanent public ledger neither of them fully accounted for. The unraveling began with financial forensics. Investigators with IRS Criminal Investigation, working alongside the FBI and multiple Inspector General offices, began cross-referencing blockchain transaction data against the Silk Road server logs seized during the original investigation. Bitcoin transactions are permanent and public, even when the identities behind them are hidden, and patient analysts were able to trace the flow of stolen funds step by step, from the moment they left Silk Road servers to the moment they landed in Mt. Gox accounts and personal bank transfers. The very technology that made Silk Road hard to police in the first place ended up being the thing that exposed the agents investigating it. In July 2015, Carl Force pleaded guilty to a 3-count indictment covering money laundering, obstruction of justice, and extortion under color of official right. That October, he was sentenced to 78 months, 6.5 years in federal prison. The following August, Sean Bridges pleaded guilty to money laundering and obstruction of justice, and in December 2015 was sentenced to 71 months and ordered to forfeit $651,000. But Bridges wasn't finished. In a detail that almost sounds invented, he stole again after his own guilty plea. In July 2015, while awaiting sentencing for the first theft, Bridges illegally transferred more than 1,600 additional Bitcoins, funds that had been separately seized by federal authorities from another exchange called Bitstamp, out of a government-controlled wallet and into a personal account at a different exchange. He had, in effect, robbed the government a second time while under investigation for robbing it the first time. When this was discovered, Bridges pleaded guilty again in 2017 and received 2 additional years in prison, along with an order to forfeit Bitcoin and currency then valued at over $10 million, reflecting how dramatically the price of Bitcoin had climbed since the original theft. Announcing the case, the Justice Department's Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division put it plainly. There is a bright line between enforcing the law and breaking it, and officers who cross that line don't just harm their immediate victims, they betray public trust in the entire system. The case became a frequently cited example in later discussions of oversight for undercover cryptocurrency investigations, precisely because it exposed how little independent verification existed around agents who had direct, unsupervised access to seized digital funds. In the years since, law enforcement agencies have faced growing pressure to tighten how seized cryptocurrency is custodied during ongoing investigations, specifically to prevent a repeat of what Force and Bridges had gotten away with for so long. Carl Force was released in October 2020 after serving roughly 5.5 years. Sean Bridges was released a year later, in October 2021, after serving about 6 years total across both cases. Curtis Green, the employee both a drug lord and a federal agent had separately tried to destroy, survived the entire ordeal and went on to cooperate with prosecutors. What makes the story endure isn't just that 2 law enforcement officers stole money. It's the sheer tangle of deception layered on deception. A federal agent running unauthorized fake identities to sell secrets to the same criminal he was building a case against. A staged murder that convinced a real person he'd ordered a killing. And a second agent whose theft triggered a real retaliatory hit order against an innocent, still living victim. All while the official version of the Silk Road takedown was being celebrated as a landmark cybercrime victory. The blockchain that Ulbricht believed made Silk Road untraceable ended up being the same tool that caught the men who were supposed to be catching him.